Burned copper, old sweat, and the sharp metallic bite of recycled air perfectly capture the stench of a dying machine or a dying man. Nobody mentions that particular detail when they ship you out to the rim. They promise stars, but deliver only rust. Mindless of anything but his own miserable business, Hugo was simply trying to fix a broken vent when his past decided to tap him on the shoulder. Playing the hero was never on his agenda. The universal translator glitch meant everyone on Station 42 called the reigning monarch of the Andromeda Coalition Queen Catherine. Nobody knew her actual name, and nobody cared enough to fix the software. The brass just wanted her money, her signature on a localized trade treaty, and her absolute assurance that her dreadnoughts wouldn't turn their little spinning tin can into a cloud of radioactive confetti. Hugo didn't care about any of that. He cared about the number 3 atmospheric scrubber in Sector 4. He was elbow deep in the primary filtration housing, blind, operating entirely on touch and a rising sense of violent frustration. The grease in here wasn't the slick, synthetic kind they use in the core worlds. It was gritty. It felt like sand mixed with cold lard, and it was currently packed under his fingernails and smeared across his left cheek. "Hugo!" The comms unit in his ear crackled. It sounded like Thomas was chewing on the microphone. "Tell me you're not still in the vents." "I'm in the vents," Hugo muttered, gritting his teeth as he blindly fitted a socket wrench over a stripped bolt. He yanked. The wrench slipped. His knuckles smashed into a sharp, unyielding edge of galvanized steel. He didn't scream. He just hissed out a breath through his teeth and closed his eyes, waiting for the throbbing pain to dull into a manageable ache. A drop of blood welled up, warm and thick, mixing with the grease on his skin. "Get out of the vents, Hugo," Thomas sighed, the static popping with his exasperation. "Command wants every warm human body in the Grand Atrium. The Coalition transport is docking in 20 minutes. We need to look like a bustling, populated, prosperous station, not a ghost town run by 3 mechanics and a malfunctioning cleaning drone." "I smell like a dumpster fire, Tommy," Hugo said, wiping his bleeding knuckle on the leg of his coveralls. The heavy canvas was already stiff with old stains. "You don't want me in the atrium. I'll offend the royal nostrils." "I don't care if you smell like a dead grox. Get your ass down here. Stand in the back. Look busy. Look respectful. If this treaty falls through because they think we lack manpower, Command is going to dock our pay for the next decade." Hugo stared at the heavy, rusted grate of the scrubber. The station's hum vibrated through the metal panels directly into his kneecaps. It was a low, steady thrum. It was the only thing keeping the vacuum of space from sucking their lungs out through their noses, and he was the one keeping it running. Not Command. Him. But he knew better than to argue with Thomas when his voice pitched up like that. "Fine," he grunted. "Give me 10. He crawled backward out of the access shaft, his boots scraping against the corrugated floor. The maintenance corridor was dimly lit, illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes that smelled faintly of burning plastic. He stood up, his spine popping in 3 distinct places. He was only 32, but his skeleton felt like it belonged to a man twice his age. Gravity plating on these cheap human stations was notoriously inconsistent. Some days a person weighed 100 pounds, some days 200. It took a toll. He grabbed his tool belt from the floor, the heavy metal wrenches clanking together in a chaotic rhythm. He dragged a filthy rag out of his back pocket and scrubbed at his hands. It didn't do much good. The black grease was practically tattooed into his calluses. As he walked toward the primary elevators, his stomach gave a sour lurch. He blamed it on the cheap synthetic coffee he'd chugged at 0400 hours, but he knew that was a lie. He hated crowds. He hated the polished, sterile air of the command decks. It reminded him too much of hospitals, and hospitals reminded him of Tartarus 9. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the memory before it could take root. Don't go there, he told himself. That was 3 years ago. Different sector, different life. But the smell of the ozone from the faulty elevator panel brought it rushing back anyway. The smell of plasma fire melting through heavy bulkheads. The deafening roar of mercenary dropships. The suffocating heat of the smuggling compartment he'd crammed himself into, holding a hand over a terrified, shaking mouth while heavy boots stomped past on the metal grating above them. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a cargo hauler who happened to be on the wrong rock at the wrong time. He did what he had to do to survive, and he took a stray kid with him because leaving her would have been slightly more cowardly than he was comfortable with. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. He stepped in, staring at his reflection in the polished steel doors. Dark hair, cut jaggedly with a pair of utility scissors. Bags under his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. A smear of dark grease across his cheek that looked violently like dried blood. Just stand in the back, he whispered to his reflection. Keep your head down. The grand atrium of Station 42 was a desperate attempt by human architects to prove they belonged in the wider galaxy. It was a cavernous space, spanning 3 decks, with an arched ceiling made of transparent aluminum that looked out into the starfield. The floor was synthetic marble, polished to a mirror shine that made Hugo acutely aware of the deep, muddy treads of his work boots. By the time he arrived, the room was already packed. Hundreds of station personnel were lined up in neat, orderly rows. The officers were up front, choking in their stiff, high-collared dress blues, their brass buttons gleaming under the harsh, white overhead lights. Behind them were the administrative staff, looking nervous and clutching data pads. And way in the back, huddled near the structural pillars, were the dregs. The mechanics, the cargo loaders, the waste management technicians. His people. Hugo slid into the formation next to Jenkins, a towering guy from Mars with a permanent scowl and hands the size of dinner plates. He took one look at Hugo and wrinkled his nose. "You smell like shit, Artie," Jenkins whispered, not moving his lips. "Number 3 scrubber," Hugo replied, staring straight ahead. "Ah, God bless you. Better you than me." The station's deck vibrated. It wasn't the steady, comforting hum of their own engines. This was a deep, resonant shudder that traveled up through the soles of his boots and rattled the teeth in his skull. The Coalition dreadnought had made hard seal with the docking ring. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the atrium. Even Jenkins stopped breathing through his mouth. The air itself seemed to thin out, the pressure dropping slightly as the massive airlock cycled. Then, the primary blast doors at the far end of the hall began to slide apart. The sound was a heavy, hydraulic grind that echoed through the cavernous space. The Royal Guard stepped through first. They weren't human, though they shared a basic bipedal structure. They were taller, broader, entirely encased in armor that looked like dark, polished obsidian. The armor didn't clank or rattle. It shifted silently, absorbing the light around it. They carried energy rifles that hummed with a low, predatory frequency. Hugo felt the hair on his arms stand up. That hum wasn't just noise. It was active microwave radiation, bleeding off their power cells. They formed two perfect lines, creating a wide corridor down the center of the atrium. Then the monarch appeared. Queen Catherine was tall, fluid, and terrifyingly elegant. Her skin was a pale, luminescent blue, almost translucent under the station's harsh lighting. She wore a gown of spun silver that seemed to move independently of her, rippling like water even when she stood still. Her face was a masterclass in alien stoicism. High, sharp cheekbones, eyes entirely black save for a single, pulsing pinprick of gold in the center of each. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace, pausing every few steps to acknowledge the station commanders, bowing awkwardly in their stiff uniforms. Hugo felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, pooling uncomfortably at the waistband of his coveralls. He shifted his weight, his right knee flaring with a familiar, dull pain. He just wanted this to be over. He wanted to go back to the humid, filthy, predictable dark of the maintenance shafts. He hated the bright lights. He hated the feeling of being exposed. Then he saw her. Holding the queen's left hand was a child. Princess Lily, the translator algorithms had decided. She was tiny, barely reaching her mother's hip. She wore a smaller, less intricate version of the silver gown, but unlike her mother, she wasn't walking with stoic grace. She was looking around, her large, dark eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and a deep, ingrained wariness. Hugo frowned. There was something about the way she held her shoulders, high, tight, the way she scanned the upper balconies before looking at the people in front of her. It was the body language of someone who had learned, very early on, that spaces with high ceilings were dangerous. It was the body language of a survivor. He swallowed hard, a sudden, inexplicable knot tightening in his throat. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second. "Stop it," he thought. "You're projecting. She's a royal alien brat who eats off platinum plates. She's not the kid from the mining colony." When he opened his eyes, the procession had moved closer. They were passing the midsection of the hall now, moving toward the rear where the unwashed masses stood. Command had wanted them to look like a populous station, which meant the Queen had to walk the entire length of the atrium before reaching the VIP lift. "Look at the stones on her," Jenkins whispered, barely audible. "Bet one of those rocks could buy this whole station." "Shut up!" Hugo hissed back. His palms were suddenly slick with sweat. He rubbed them against his canvas pants, his breathing growing shallow. Something was wrong. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. The polished floor seemed to tilt slightly. He kept his chin tucked down, staring intensely at a small scratch on the synthetic marble near the tip of his left boot. He just had to hold still for 2 more minutes. They would walk past, get in the lift, and he could go back to his life. But as the procession neared the back rows, the low hum of the Royal Guard's weapons seemed to grow louder, vibrating against his eardrums. The Queen stopped. He didn't look up, but he could see the hem of her silver gown shimmering in his peripheral vision just 10 feet away. The entire station command staff held their breath. Then, the child let go of her mother's hand. The soft pat-pat-pat of the little princess's shoes on the marble floor cut through the absolute silence of the atrium like a gunshot. She had broken rank. She had stepped away from the protective umbrella of her mother and the towering obsidian guards. Hugo kept his eyes glued to the floor. "Don't look up. Don't move. You are a shadow. You are a grease stain on the wall." The small footsteps stopped. Right in front of him, he could see the toes of her soft, silver slippers. They were immaculate, not a speck of dust on them. They stood in stark, almost offensive contrast to his heavy, steel-toed boots, which were crusted with chemical runoff and rust. He couldn't help it. His gaze slowly traveled up, past the hem of the silver gown, past the tiny, delicate hands clutched together in front of her chest, up to her face. Her skin was pale blue, and her eyes were large pools of black. But right now, the tiny gold pinpricks in the center of her eyes were dilated, pulsing rapidly. She was staring directly into his face, completely ignoring the streak of black grease and the exhaustion etched into his features. For a long, terrible second, neither of them breathed. Hugo recognized the slight, jagged scar above her left eyebrow. A plasma burn. It had been messy when it happened, bubbling the skin. He had slapped a filthy field dressing on it in the dark, his hands shaking so hard he could barely tear the adhesive. His stomach didn't just drop, it plummeted into a bottomless abyss. A cold, prickling sweat erupted across his scalp. No, the silence in the atrium was absolute. You could hear the hum of the air scrubbers recycling the oxygen. You could hear the distant, muffled heartbeat of the station. The Queen took a half step forward, a look of profound, terrifying confusion crossing her regal features. "Lily?" Her voice was musical, translated perfectly into English, but laced with a sharp edge of maternal panic. The tiny princess didn't look back at her mother. She didn't take her eyes off Hugo. She slowly raised a small, pale blue finger and pointed it directly at the center of his chest. "Mom," she whispered. Her voice was incredibly quiet, but in the dead silence of the hall, it carried like a bell. "That's him." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. For a fraction of a second, Hugo thought about running. It was a stupid primal instinct. His muscles bunched, his right leg twitching backward. But he didn't get the chance. The reaction of the royal guard was instantaneous and violently fast. There was no hesitation, no assessment of threat levels. Their princess had pointed at a filthy human in the back row, and that was all the authorization they needed. A chorus of high-pitched whines filled the air as 12 obsidian-clad guards pivoted sharply, bringing their heavy energy rifles to bear. 12 laser sights, burning a brilliant, angry red, snapped onto his body. 4 on his chest, 2 on his head, the rest scattered across his limbs. Clatter. The heavy steel socket wrench Hugo had forgotten he was still holding slipped from his numb fingers. It hit the marble floor with a harsh, ringing crash that made half the station's officers flinch. "Stand down!" Thomas yelled from the front, his voice cracking with pure terror. "He's just a mechanic! Stand down!" Nobody listened to him. The guards didn't even blink. The Queen stepped forward, her silver dress flowing around her. The anger on her face was gone, replaced by a shock so profound it made her look suddenly fragile. She looked at the little girl, then followed the line of the child's finger directly to Hugo's greasy, blood-stained coveralls. "Him?" the Queen breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Are you certain?" The little princess nodded slowly. She lowered her hand, but took a step closer to him. The red laser sights on his chest didn't waver. "He smells the same," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Like the dark room, like metal and blood." Hugo felt exposed, flayed open under the harsh lights of the atrium. He wasn't a hero. Tartarus 9 wasn't a rescue mission. It was a slaughter, and he had hidden in a smuggling crate like a rat. He had dragged her in there with him because she wouldn't stop crying, and she was going to get them both killed. He had held his dirty, calloused hand over her mouth so hard he thought he might break her jaw. He didn't fight for her. He didn't save her with bravery. He saved her with cowardice and sheer, dumb luck. And when the Planetary Defense Force finally broke through the rubble 2 days later, he didn't stick around for medals. He handed the trembling, dehydrated alien child to a medic, stole a seat on a refugee transport, and spent the next 3 years trying to wash the smell of burned ozone and fear out of his hair. "You," the Queen said. She was speaking directly to him now. The royal command in her voice had vanished. She sounded like a mother who had just found a ghost. Hugo couldn't speak. His mouth was dry as dust. He stood frozen, 12 guns pointed at his head, the red lasers illuminating the grease on his coveralls, acutely aware that his knees were shaking. Jenkins slowly edged away from him, leaving him standing alone in an island of space. "You," the Queen repeated, her voice trembling. "You are the phantom of Tartarus." Hugo closed his eyes. The blinding white lights of the atrium faded, replaced by the suffocating darkness of the smuggling crate. He could feel the heat. He could feel the little girl shaking against his chest. He opened his eyes, looking past the guns, past the terrified station crew, and met the Queen's gaze. He didn't stand tall. He didn't puff out his chest. He just slouched, his shoulders dropping as a bone-deep exhaustion washed over him. "No," he croaked, his voice rough and defensive. "I'm just Hugo, and I just want to fix my vent." The silence that followed was so absolute, so dense, it felt like it could crush the life right out of him. The 12 red laser dots didn't move. They burned against his chest, casting a hazy crimson glow over the grease stains. He could feel the heat of them, or maybe that was just his mind playing tricks. The atrium was so quiet, he could hear the hydraulic micro-adjustments in the guard's obsidian armor. "Lower your weapons," the Queen said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't boom, but it carried an absolute crushing authority that didn't leave room for debate. The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, a delay born of protective instinct, before the high-pitched whine of their energy rifles spooled down into a dull, dormant thrum. The red dots vanished. The sudden absence of that light felt like a physical weight lifting off Hugo's ribs, and his lungs finally remembered how to process oxygen. He took a ragged, shallow breath. It tasted like bitter adrenaline and copper. Station Commander Harrison broke ranks. He was a plump, red-faced man who usually spent his days buried in logistics manifests, and right now he looked like he was about to have a massive coronary. "Your Majesty," Harrison stammered, his boots squeaking horribly against the polished marble as he hurried forward. "I apologize. I don't know what this man has done, but he is a low-level contractor. He is not cleared for..." Silence. The Queen didn't even look at him. She just raised a single, pale blue hand, and Harrison's mouth snapped shut so hard, Hugo heard his teeth click. She took another step toward him. The guards shifted, parting slightly to let her through, but their posture remained rigid. Ready. Up close, the queen didn't smell like a living thing. There was no sweat, no subtle musk of skin or hair. She smelled like a sterile surgical bay right after a deep clean, like pure, unadulterated ozone and crushed ice. It was unnerving. She stopped 3 feet away. Hugo was tall, but she had an inch on him, and she didn't have the decency to slouch. Her black eyes, with those pulsing gold centers, searched his face. She looked at the jagged haircut, the dark circles under his eyes, the fresh smear of blood on his cheek from where he'd hit his knuckles in the vent. He hated being looked at. He felt his jaw tighten, the muscles grinding. When the mercenaries breached the eastern wing of the planetary governor's estate, the queen said softly, her voice meant only for him, they slaughtered the primary guard in under 4 minutes. We found the bodies. We found the ash. Hugo stared at the collar of her silver dress. He didn't want to hear this. He shifted his weight, his bad knee popping loudly in the quiet space. We searched the rubble for 6 days, she continued, her tone painfully even, though her eyes betrayed a frantic, suppressed emotion. We assumed she had been vaporized in the plasma barrage, and then a medical transport logged a DNA match 3 sectors away. An anonymous cargo hauler had dropped her at a triage tent and vanished into the crowd before the intake nurses could even log his registration. She paused. The air between them felt thick, charged with static. They said a human saved her, the queen whispered. A ghost. Hugo finally met her eyes. I'm not a ghost, lady. I'm a mechanic. Lily tugged on her mother's dress. The little girl stepped around the queen and walked right up to him. Up close, the scar over her left eyebrow was pale white against her blue skin. It looked clean, healed. She reached out with a tiny hand. Hugo flinched. He couldn't help it. His body jerked backward, his boots scraping harshly on the floor. Lily stopped, her hand hovering in the air. She looked at his hands, hanging uselessly at his sides. They were black with sludge, the knuckles raw, the fingernails packed with metallic grit. Slowly, she reached out again, her fingers brushing the stiff, filthy canvas of his coveralls right at the knee. You were shaking, Lily said. Her voice was small, but it ripped right through the sterile air of the atrium. In the dark, you were shaking more than I was. Hugo's throat locked up tight. He squeezed his eyes shut. Don't do this. Not here. Not in front of the brass. He remembered the crate. It smelled like rotting fish and machine oil. He remembered pulling his knees to his chest, squeezing his eyes shut as the heavy boots stomped across the metal, grating above them. He remembered sobbing, silent, pathetic, terrified tears, while this alien child stared at him in the dark. He hadn't comforted her. She had comforted him. I wasn't brave, he said. His voice was a gravelly rasp. He opened his eyes and looked at the queen, daring her to see the truth. I was hiding. I was trying to save my own miserable skin, and she was in the wrong hallway at the wrong time. I pulled her into that crate so she wouldn't scream and give me away to the death squads. That's it. There's no hero story here. The queen looked at him for a long time. The gold in her eyes slowed its frantic pulsing. In my language, the queen said softly, we have a word, Velok. It means the shield that bleeds. It does not matter if the shield was frightened. It only matters that it held. She turned slightly, addressing the room at large, but mostly locking eyes with a pale, trembling Commander Harrison. "The treaty signing will be delayed," the Queen announced, her voice returning to its normal, commanding volume. "I require a private room, and I require my daughter's savior to join us." Harrison looked like he wanted to argue, looked at the 12 heavily armed guards, and wisely swallowed his pride. "Of course, Your Majesty. The VIP lounge on Deck 2 is entirely at your disposal." The Queen turned back to Hugo. "Come." "I have a shift," he muttered, crossing his arms over his chest, mindful not to smear more grease on his own sleeves. "Number 3 scrubber is offline. If I don't fix it, this station is breathing carbon monoxide by Tuesday." Jenkins, standing a few feet away, let out a noise that sounded like a strangled cough. The Queen did not smile, but the corner of her eye twitched. "The scrubber can wait. Walk with us, Hugo." Deck 2 was a different world. It was where command entertained planetary governors and corporate executives who owned entire asteroid belts. The air here didn't smell like burned copper. It smelled like synthetic pine and expensive floral arrangements. The floors were covered in thick, sound-dampening carpet that felt obscenely soft under his heavy work boots. He was ruining it. He knew he was. Every step he took left a faint, oily impression in the pristine white fibers. He could feel Harrison walking behind them, staring at his boots with a mixture of horror and homicidal rage. He almost smiled. The VIP lounge was excessively large, featuring a sweeping view of the starfield outside. The furniture was all curved white leather and brushed steel. The royal guards took up positions outside the doors, leaving only the Queen, Lily, and Hugo inside, and Harrison, who lingered by the entrance like a bad smell, wringing his hands. "Leave us, Commander," the Queen said, without turning around. "Your Majesty, standard protocol dictates that a station representative must—" "Leave," she repeated. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harrison swallowed hard, bowed stiffly, and backed out of the room. The heavy doors hissed shut, engaging the privacy locks with a solid metallic thunk. Hugo stood awkwardly in the center of the room. The Queen moved toward one of the white leather couches, gracefully taking a seat. Lily immediately climbed up beside her, tucking her legs under her silver dress. "Please sit," the Queen gestured to the chair opposite them. "I'll stand. You are exhausted. It is written plainly across your biology." "I sit on that. I buy it," Hugo said, pointing a greasy finger at the pristine white leather. "I make 12 credits an hour. I can't afford a chair that costs more than my ship." The Queen looked at the chair, then looked at him. "I will purchase the chair." "I'll stand," he repeated stubbornly, crossing his arms and leaning his back against the cold, brushed steel of the bulkhead. It felt familiar, grounding. The Queen didn't press the issue. She pressed a button on the low table between them. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a built-in synthesizer. She tapped a few keys, and a moment later, a delicate ceramic cup filled with a steaming amber liquid rose from the console. She picked it up and offered it to him. "Gilead root. It is a mild stimulant. It will help with the shock." Hugo stared at the cup. His hands were filthy. If he took it, he would leave black fingerprints all over the delicate white ceramic. but his mouth was dry, and the adrenaline crash was starting to hit him. The muscles in his back were twitching, a dull ache spreading down his spine. He stepped forward, took the cup by the very top rim to minimize the mess, and stepped back to his wall. He took a sip. It didn't taste like root. It tasted like sunlight and honey, smooth and warm, coating the back of his throat and erasing the lingering taste of copper. It was easily the best thing he had consumed in 3 years. He hated it. "We looked for you," the Queen said, her black eyes resting on him. "For a year. We scoured the refugee registries. We ran biometric scans on every transport that left the Tartarus sector." "I'm not exactly eager to be found," he said, staring into the amber liquid. "People who get noticed usually get dead." "You dropped her at the medical tent," the Queen said, ignoring his cynicism. "You did not stay for the reward. You did not register your name." "Why?" Hugo let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. It sounded ugly in the quiet, elegant room. "Reward? Lady, I was driving an unregistered rust bucket with a hold full of contraband engine parts. The Planetary Defense Force was arresting anyone who didn't have a corporate badge. I handed her to a nurse and ran before they could ask why a human cargo hauler was carrying a Coalition Royale in a duffel bag. You protected her. I survived," he snapped, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "I told you, I'm not a hero. I'm a coward. Do you know what happened in that crate?" He pointed a shaking, grease-stained finger at Lily. The little girl just watched him, her large eyes unblinking. "The mercs were executing survivors," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The memory was bleeding into the room, overlaying the pristine white walls with the dark, suffocating confines of the hold. "They were walking down the rows, shooting anything that moved. I pulled her into a smuggling compartment meant for narcotics. It was 2 feet wide. When they walked past, she started to cry." He looked at his hands. The black grease seemed to morph, just for a second, into dried blood. "I put my hand over her mouth," he whispered, the shame of it burning hot in his chest. "I held it there. I pressed so hard I thought I was going to suffocate her. I bruised her face. I was fully prepared to let her pass out from lack of oxygen if it meant she stayed quiet. Because if she made a sound, we both died. I didn't fight for her. I hurt her to save myself." He looked up, expecting to see disgust on the Queen's face, expecting the royal wrath to finally fall on him for manhandling her precious bloodline. Instead, the Queen was looking at him with a profound, terrifying sorrow. "She told me," the Queen said softly. He blinked. "What?" "She told me what you did." The Queen set her own cup down, the ceramic clinking softly against the table. "She told me that the human smelled like rust and that he was crying. She told me that he covered her mouth, but that he also wrapped his other arm around her so tightly she couldn't feel the vibration of the boots above them." Hugo felt his breath catch. He looked at Lily. The little princess nodded. "You hid my eyes," she said simply. "You didn't let me see them die." He swallowed hard. The thick knot in his throat was back, threatening to choke him. He looked away, staring fiercely at the grain of the brushed steel wall next to him. He took another drink of the tea, letting the heat burn away the cold tightness in his chest. "You survived," the Queen said, her voice anchoring him back to the present. "And you ensured she survived." In the brutal mathematics of the universe, Hugo, intent matters far less than outcome. So what? He rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his dirty sleeve. You found me. You said thank you. I accept. Now can I go back to my vents? No, the Queen said. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. You cannot. Hugo pushed off the wall, his muscles tensing. Excuse me? The Queen stood up. She smoothed the front of her silver gown, the fabric shimmering like liquid mercury. In the Andromeda Coalition, we do not operate on the human concept of a simple thank you for matters of blood. We operate on the Kalen. She took a step toward him. The Kalen is a debt of existence. You preserved the line of succession. You preserved my daughter. By our law and by my own personal mandate, your life is now irrevocably tethered to ours. He took a step back, his boots squelching softly in the plush carpet. Lady, stop. I don't want a medal. I don't want a chest full of your coalition credits. I just want to be left alone. It is not about what you want, she said, her black eyes pinning him in place. It is about the balance of the universe. You are currently residing on a decaying orbital station, performing manual labor in hazardous conditions. This is unacceptable for a bearer of the Kalen. It's my job, he growled. It was your job, she corrected. As of this moment, you are under the protection of the Coalition Crown. You will return with us to Andromeda. You will be given a suite in the royal compound. You will never want for sustenance, medical care, or security again. You are part of our house. Hugo stared at her. The sheer, overwhelming absurdity of the offer crashed over him. A suite in a royal compound. Him, a guy who currently had 3 broken fingernails and a concerning rash from exposure to refined engine coolant. No, the word slipped out before he could even process it. The Queen paused. I do not think the universal translator accurately conveyed your response. It conveyed it perfectly, he said, his voice hardening. He set the delicate ceramic cup down on the edge of the nearest table. It left a faint, gray smudge of grease on the white rim. I said no. Lily looked up, her expression shifting from calm to sudden distress. You won't come? Hugo looked down at the little girl, feeling a sharp pang of guilt, but he crushed it down. He couldn't afford guilt. Guilt is what gets you killed in the rim. Kid, look at me, he said, gesturing to his filthy clothes. I'm a wrench monkey. I drink cheap coffee. I sleep on a mattress that feels like it's stuffed with gravel, and I swear at inanimate objects for a living. I don't belong in a palace. I'd go crazy in a week, and you'd be sick of the smell of me in 2. We have excellent bathing facilities, the Queen noted, her tone completely serious. That's not the point, he snapped, running a hand through his jagged, dirty hair. I don't want to be a pet. I don't want to be some token human you parade around your court to show how magnanimous you are. Look at the stray we picked up. Watch him eat with a fork. The Queen's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine anger replacing her stoic calm. You insult me. I do not take pets. I am offering you sanctuary. I don't need sanctuary. I need to fix the number 3 scrubber. He pointed a finger at the heavy doors. Out there, on this rusting piece of garbage station, I know who I am. I know what makes sense. If a pipe bursts, I weld it. If a circuit fries, I bypass it. The rules are simple. Your world, courts, politics, life debts. I don't play that game. I'd be dead in a month. You are already dying here, the Queen countered quietly. Your scans show elevated radiation exposure, severe calcium depletion in your joints, and chronic adrenal fatigue. You are slowly killing yourself in the dark, Hugo. Why? Because the dark makes sense, he said bitterly. He turned away from her, walking toward the large viewport. Outside, the vast, empty blackness of space stretched on forever, dotted with the cold, distant light of stars. It was massive, indifferent, and completely uncaring. He liked it that way. I didn't save your daughter because I was noble, he said to the window, watching his own reflection in the glass. I saved her because we were both trapped in the same box. Now you're just trying to put me in a nicer box, a gilded cage. He turned back to face them. You signed your treaty, right? You got what you wanted from command. The Queen stiffened. The treaty is a minor political maneuver. This is a matter of honor. Well, human honor is a lot cheaper, he said. Keep your treaty. Keep your credits. Just let me walk out that door, and we can all pretend this never happened. Before the Queen could respond, the lights in the VIP lounge flickered. It wasn't a subtle dimming. The bright, sterile white lights died completely for 2 long seconds, plunging the room into darkness. The heavy, comforting hum of the station's primary life support generators, a sound so constant you only noticed it when it changed, suddenly stuttered. It sounded like a massive metallic heart skipping a beat. The lights slammed back on, but they were no longer bright white. They were an angry, emergency amber. The low-frequency vibration of the deck plates shifted, changing from a steady purr to a harsh, grinding vibration that rattled the ceramic cups on the table. Hugo didn't need a diagnostic pad to know what that was. Number 3 scrubber just seized, he said, the instinct of a decade of maintenance work overriding the tension in the room. The primary exhaust manifold just clogged, and the backup fans are trying to overcompensate. Hugo, the Queen began. If I don't clear the intake valves in the next 10 minutes, he interrupted, moving quickly toward the heavy doors. The pressure feedback is going to blow the secondary seals. This entire sector will flood with toxic coolant gas. Your royal lungs won't like it any more than mine. He hit the manual override on the door panel. It didn't open. The emergency lockdown had engaged. He cursed loudly, reaching to his belt, pulling a heavy pry bar from the loops. Stand back. He wedged the cold steel into the seam of the heavy blast doors and threw his entire weight against it. His bad knee screamed in protest, a sharp stabbing agony that made his vision swim. But the metal groaned, and the doors forced apart just enough to break the magnetic seal. He looked back over his shoulder at the Queen and the Princess. They looked entirely out of place in the amber emergency lighting, their silver dresses catching the warning strobes. I'm not a hero, he told them, breathing hard. But I am the only guy on this station who knows how to bypass the tertiary valves. He ripped the doors open and sprinted out into the flashing corridor, leaving the royal family behind. The primary corridors of Station 42 were a madhouse. The emergency amber strobes painted the fleeing crew in harsh, jagged flashes, making them look like a panicked herd of cattle caught in a lightning storm. The klaxons were deafening, a rhythmic, bone-rattling bray, bray, bray that made it impossible to think. Hugo didn't need to think. His body knew the route to Sector 4 by muscle memory. He shoved past a knot of terrified administrative clerks who were scrambling toward the escape pods. They were going the wrong way. If the secondary seals on the number 3 scrubber blew, The toxic coolant gas would flood the upper decks first, seeking the lower pressure of the lifeboats. "Move!" he roared, throwing a hard shoulder into a panicked lieutenant who froze in the center of the junction. The air was already changing. The sterile, recycled oxygen was thickening. He could taste it on the back of his tongue, a sharp, metallic tang like sucking on a copper wire, mixed with the acrid chemical stink of burning insulation. The exhaust manifolds were cooking off. He hit the stairwell to the lower engineering decks and took the metal steps 3 at a time. His bad knee screamed with every impact, sending jagged spikes of white-hot pain shooting up his thigh, but he shoved it down into the dark, familiar place where he kept all his other useless complaints. By the time he reached the primary bulkhead doors for Sector 4, his lungs were burning, and his canvas coveralls were plastered to his back with cold sweat. The heavy blast doors were sealed shut. The digital panel next to them was flashing a bright, angry crimson. Environmental hazard. Lockdown initiated. "Not today, you piece of garbage," he muttered. He dropped to his knees, his heavy boots scraping the grated floor. He pulled a flathead screwdriver from his belt, wedged it under the edge of the access panel, and twisted violently. The cheap plastic cover snapped off, bouncing away into the darkness. Inside, a mess of multicolored wires pulsed with station power. He didn't have time to slice the encryption codes. He grabbed his wire cutters, snipped the primary data line, stripped the ends with his teeth, spitting the bitter, rubbery casing onto the floor, and jammed the raw copper directly into the bypass relay. Blue sparks exploded outward, stinging his knuckles, but the heavy magnetic locks disengaged with a deep, satisfying thud. He grabbed the heavy manual wheel on the center of the door, planted his boots, and hauled. The metal groaned, protesting the lack of grease, but it slowly slid open just enough for him to slip through sideways. The heat hit him instantly. It was a physical wall, thick and suffocating. The temperature inside the scrubber housing had to be hovering around 130 degrees. The air was hazy with a thin, pale mist, vaporized coolant leaking from the microfractures in the pipes. The noise was worse. The seized filtration drum was screaming. It sounded like a massive wounded animal grinding its teeth against a chalkboard. The immense kinetic energy of the station's airflow was slamming into a dead stop, and the kinetic friction was translating entirely into heat. Hugo staggered forward, throwing his arm up to shield his eyes from the stinging vapor. He navigated the labyrinth of heavy pipes and scaffolding, his boots slipping on the slick condensation gathering on the floor grates. There it was, the primary release valve. It was a massive, spoked iron wheel attached to the main intake pipe. The digital servo motor attached to it was completely blackened, a smoking crater of melted plastic and fused wiring. The surge had fried it instantly. He glanced at the analog pressure gauge bolted to the pipe above the wheel. The needle was violently vibrating, buried deep in the red zone. 94% capacity. When it hit 100, the cast iron housing would shatter like a glass bomb, and a wave of supercooled toxic Freon derivative would instantly freeze the lungs of everyone on the station. "Come on," he wheezed, his throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. He grabbed the iron wheel with both hands. The metal was scalding hot. He could feel the heat searing through the thick leather of his work gloves, but he didn't let go. He braced his right boot against the heavy pipe flange, locked his core, and pulled with everything he had. Nothing. It was rusted solid, fused by years of neglect and the sudden, massive thermal expansion. "Move, you bastard!" he screamed at the inanimate metal. He threw his weight backward, pulling until his biceps trembled and the tendons in his neck felt like they were going to snap. The wheel didn't budge a fraction of an inch. The pressure gauge ticked upward, 96%. The screaming of the sea's drum dropped an octave, a deep structural groan that vibrated through the soles of his boots right up into his teeth. The machine was tearing itself apart. He let go of the wheel, his chest heaving. His gloves were smoking. He patted down his belt, frantic, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He needed leverage. He unclipped the heavy 2-foot steel pry bar. He jammed it between the spokes of the iron wheel, locking it against the center axle. He grabbed the far end of the bar, leaned his entire body weight into it, and pushed. His boots slid backward on the slick floor. The raw skin on his knuckles tore open again, bleeding sluggishly into his gloves. The metal bar bent slightly under the torque. "Please," he whispered, the word tasting like rust and defeat. The gauge hit 98%. A secondary pipe across the room blew a gasket, shooting a jet of high pressure, blinding white steam into the air. He couldn't move it. He was just one guy. He was exhausted. He was broken. And he was going to die in a dark, boiling room smelling of cheap engine grease. Then, the blast doors behind him hissed open. Hugo didn't turn around. He couldn't afford to lose his leverage on the pry bar. "Get out!" he screamed over the roaring machinery, assuming it was Jenkins making a suicidal rescue attempt. "It's gonna blow! Get the hell out of here!" The footsteps that approached weren't the heavy, clumsy clatter of station boots. They were smooth, rhythmic. The soft, hydraulic whir of advanced servos cutting through the mechanical chaos. A hand grabbed the steel pry bar right next to his. He snapped his head sideways. It was an obsidian gauntlet. The Royal Guard stood next to him, his massive armored frame completely dwarfing Hugo's slouched posture. His helmet was expressionless, a blank slate of dark metal reflecting the amber warning lights. "Step aside, Hugo," a voice commanded. He looked past the guard. Standing in the doorway of the sweltering, toxic boiler room, looking like a hallucination born of heat stroke, was Queen Catherine. She had not fled to her dreadnought. She had walked directly into the bowels of the station. Her silver gown was already stained with a streak of black grease from the doorframe, and the extreme heat was causing her pale blue skin to flush a deep, bruised purple. But she stood perfectly straight, her black eyes locked onto the pressure gauge. "What are you doing?" he choked out, coughing violently as a wisp of coolant gas caught in his throat. "You need to leave. The Kalen does not permit me to abandon a shield that is breaking," she said simply. Her voice was amplified by a small unit on her collar, cutting cleanly through the deafening noise of the failing machinery. She gestured to the two guards flanking her. "Assist him." "They don't know how," Hugo yelled, refusing to let go of the bar. "It's not just turning it. The thermal expansion warped the locking pin. If they just force the wheel, it'll shear the stem and the valve will stay permanently closed." The Queen looked at him, understanding instantly. "What must be done?" He pointed a shaking gloved finger at a narrow, steaming gap between the valve housing and the main pipe. "There's a manual release catch in there. It's jammed. Someone has to reach in, press the release pin down, and hold it while the wheel is turned. But it's right next to the exhaust manifold. My guards cannot fit their gauntlets into that gap, the Queen assessed, her eyes narrowing. I know, Hugo said, his voice dropping to a harsh rasp. He looked at the gauge. 99%. The metal housing of the scrubber was beginning to bulge, the rivets pinging like bullets as they snapped off and ricocheted around the room. I have to do it. He looked at the massive guard standing next to him. When I say turn, you turn it. Don't stop until it locks. Understand? The guard gave a single, sharp nod. He grabbed the iron spokes of the wheel with both armored hands. The servos in his suit whined, locking into place. Hugo stripped off his right glove. He couldn't feel the tiny release pin through the thick leather. He took a deep, jagged breath, tasting copper and ash, and shoved his bare arm into the gap. The heat was instantaneous and horrifying. The ambient air in the gap was superheated. The metal of the exhaust manifold, inches from his skin, glowed a dull, angry orange. His arm hair singed off in a fraction of a second, the smell of burning keratin mixing with the ozone. He wedged his hand deeper, his fingers frantically tracing the rough, rusted contours of the valve housing. The metal burned his skin, sending a sickening jolt of pure white agony up his arm. He wanted to pull back. Every evolutionary instinct in his brain screamed at him to yank his hand out of the fire. Just a coward, his own voice echoed in his head, just trying to survive. His fingertips found the small, square head of the release pin. It was stuck fast. "Turn!" he screamed, pressing down on the blistering metal pin with all the strength in his right hand. The guard twisted the wheel. The sheer hydraulic power of the obsidian armor applied a terrifying amount of torque. The iron wheel groaned, fighting back. Hugo felt the mechanical tension transfer directly into the pin he was holding. The rough metal ground into the pads of his fingers, slicing through the blisters. "More!" he roared, tears of sheer pain blurring his vision. The guard braced his boots and gave a massive heave. Crack! The rust seal broke with a sound like a gunshot. The locking pin snapped downward under his fingers, giving way just as the massive iron wheel spun freely to the left. Hugo violently yanked his arm out of the gap just as the primary release valve blew open. The sound was apocalyptic, a deafening, roaring shriek of expanding gas as the superheated coolant vented upward through the emergency exhaust pipes, bypassing the seized drum. A massive cloud of thick white vapor blasted out of the top vents, completely obscuring the ceiling. He fell backward, landing hard on the slick floor grates. He clutched his right arm to his chest. The skin was bright, angry red, blistering rapidly from the wrist to the elbow. It felt like it was submerged in boiling acid. Above him, the vibrating needle on the pressure gauge violently slammed backward, dropping from the red zone down to a safe, steady 30%. The monstrous groaning of the machine faded, replaced by the heavy, rushing sound of free-flowing gas. The station was safe. Hugo laid on his back, staring up at the white vapor swirling in the amber emergency lights. He couldn't catch his breath. The pain in his arm was a living, breathing thing, wrapping its jaws around his nervous system. A shadow fell over him. Queen Catherine stood above him. Her immaculate silver gown was ruined, soaked at the hem from the condensation on the floor and dotted with black soot. She looked down at him, her black eyes reflecting the amber strobes. She didn't look disgusted. She looked entirely, profoundly grave. "You are a remarkably difficult man to keep alive, Hugo," she said quietly. He let out a weak, coughing laugh that tasted like blood. "Told you, I just want to fix my vent." The darkness crept in around the edges of his vision, thick and welcoming. He didn't fight it. For the first time in 3 years, he just let go. Waking up was a slow, confusing process. First came the smell. It was wrong. There was no tang of recycled air, no underlying scent of ozone or burned coffee. It smelled like pure, distilled water, and a faint hint of something floral, maybe orchids. Then came the texture. Hugo wasn't lying on his lumpy, spring-shot cot in the maintenance quarters. He was floating. The mattress beneath him was some kind of smart gel that contoured perfectly to his spine, erasing the chronic ache in his lower back that had been his constant companion for a decade. Hugo snapped his eyes open. The ceiling was a soft, glowing expanse of pearlescent white. He was in a medical bay, but not the rusted, underfunded clinic on Station 42. The walls were seamless curved alloys, and the diagnostic monitors hovering near the bed were holographic projections, silent and unobtrusive. He tried to sit up. His right arm felt heavy and numb. He looked down. It was encased from fingertips to elbow in a thick, translucent sleeve of blue biogel. Underneath the cooling jelly, the angry, blistered skin was already pale pink, rapidly regenerating. "I wouldn't move too quickly." He turned his head. Queen Catherine was sitting in a slender chair by the viewport. She was no longer wearing the heavy, formal silver gown. Instead, she wore a simple, elegant tunic of dark blue material that looked softer than silk. She had a datapad resting on her lap. "Where am I?" he rasped. His voice sounded terrible, rough from the chemical smoke. "You are aboard the Ethel Guard," the Queen replied, setting the datapad aside. "My flagship. You inhaled a significant amount of vaporized coolant and suffered second-degree thermal burns to your right arm. The station's medical facilities were inadequate." Hugo stared at her, the memories of the boiler room rushing back. The heat, the screaming metal, the obsidian guards. He looked around the pristine room. Folded neatly on a chair in the corner was a familiar sight, his canvas coveralls. They had been thoroughly cleaned, the heavy stains and grease lifted out, but they were still his. They still had the patched knee and the frayed cuffs. Beside them, his battered leather tool belt sat in a coil, every wrench and screwdriver meticulously wiped down. The contrast between his cheap, battered gear and the royal medical suite was jarring. "You hijacked me," he said, leaning back against the gel pillows, feeling a spike of defensive anger. "I told you I wasn't coming with you." "I did not hijack you," she corrected mildly. "You lost consciousness. I merely sought adequate medical care for my savior. And my daughters?" "I saved a machine," he muttered. "It's my job. If I didn't do it, I would have died too. Self-preservation." The Queen stood up and walked slowly toward the bed. "You cling to this narrative of cowardice with remarkable tenacity, Hugo. You ran toward a detonating pressure vessel while the rest of your station fled to the lifeboats. You thrust your bare flesh against superheated metal to prevent a catastrophe that would have killed thousands." She stopped at the edge of the bed, her black eyes pinning him. "Cowards run from the fire. You, Hugo, Argue with it until it submits. He looked down at the blue gel on his arm. It's just plumbing. You turn the right valve, the pressure drops. That's it. It doesn't make me a knight in shining armor. I do not need a knight, she said. He looked up, surprised by the shift in her tone. The Andromeda Coalition possesses the most advanced technology in 4 sectors, she continued, her voice taking on a practical, businesslike edge. Our ships navigate using quantum singularities. Our weapons fire focused plasma. But when our vessels travel to the rim sectors, away from the pristine shipyards of the core worlds, we face a problem. She gestured toward his folded coveralls. Our automated systems fail when exposed to the grit and chaos of the outer colonies. A speck of unrefined silicate in a quantum drive will shut down an entire dreadnought, and my engineers, raised on theory and spotless diagnostics, do not know how to fix a machine when the computer refuses to tell them what is wrong. Hugo frowned, the mechanic in him suddenly interested despite himself. Your engineers rely on digital telemetry. When the sensors fail, they're blind. You have to know how the machine sounds. You have to know what it smells like when a magnetic seal is degrading. A faint, fleeting smile touched the Queen's lips. Exactly. We do not understand bypasses. We do not comprehend brute force. She paused, letting the silence settle over the sterile room. I am withdrawing my offer of sanctuary, Hugo, she said. I see now that a gilded cage would kill you faster than the radiation on that station. He felt a sudden, bizarre twinge of disappointment, which he quickly squashed. Good, glad we agree. So, you'll drop me back on 42? No. The Queen pulled a small silver insignia pin from her pocket. It bore the crest of the Coalition. I am offering you employment, Chief Technical Liaison to the Outer Rim Fleet. You will not live in a palace. You will live in the engineering bays of our border patrols. You will teach my spotless theoretical engineers how to fix a seized vent with a steel bar and a profound amount of stubbornness. Hugo stared at the pin resting in the palm of her pale blue hand. You will be paid a staggering sum, she added. You will have full authority over the mechanical state of the fleet. And most importantly, you will be allowed to remain as filthy and irate as you desire. Before he could formulate an argument, the door to the medical bay hissed open. Princess Lily peeked around the frame. When she saw he was awake, she hurried into the room. She was wearing a casual dress today, the pale blue fabric contrasting with her skin. She walked up to the bed and carefully placed something on the pristine white tray table over his lap. It was his heavy steel socket wrench, the one he had dropped in the atrium. It hadn't been polished or sterilized. It still had the deep gouges in the handle and a faint smear of grease near the socket head. You left it, Lily said quietly. She looked at his bandaged arm, her large eyes wide. Did the dark room hurt you again? Hugo looked at the little girl, tracing the faint healed line of the plasma scar above her eyebrow. He remembered the suffocating terror of the smuggling crate. He remembered the bone-deep exhaustion of the boiler room. He had spent 3 years trying to hide from the galaxy, trying to blend into the rust and the grime so the universe wouldn't notice him. But hiding hadn't saved the station, and hiding wouldn't fix the broken things out there in the dark. He reached out with his left hand, picking up the heavy, familiar weight of the steel wrench. It grounded him. It felt real. He looked up at the Queen. If I take this job, he said, his voice rough, I don't wear a uniform. I wear my own clothes. The Queen gave a single, elegant nod. Agreed. And the coffee on this ship, he continued, leaning back into the gel pillows and closing his eyes, is probably going to be terrible. I want my own synthesizer in the engine room, programmed for the cheap synthetic garbage from the rim. I need the acid to keep me awake. It shall be done, the Queen said. Welcome to the coalition, Hugo. Hugo opened his eyes and looked at Lily, offering her a tired, lopsided smirk. Looks like you're stuck with the smell of me, kid. Lily smiled back, the tiny gold pinpricks in her eyes pulsing with sudden, bright warmth. I don't mind. You smell like a shield. Hugo squeezed the wrench in his hand, the cool metal pressing into his palm. For the first time in a long time, the smell of ozone and machine oil didn't remind him of dying. It just smelled like work. Thank you for experiencing the epic conclusion of Hugo's journey. If this gritty, emotional sci-fi finale kept you hooked, please hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories from the Outer Rim. What did you think of Hugo's final choice? Would you have taken the Queen's offer or stayed on the station? Drop a comment below and let us know. Until next time, keep your wrenches ready. Keep exploring the stars, and we will see you in the very next upload.